Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining. My name is Kristin Snowden. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of California. And these are monthly webinars that I do to talk about all things relationships because we never take a class on how to do this crazy thing called engaging with other flawed human beings in this flawed world. And golly gee, a lot of things don't go our way, and it's really hard for us to navigate the messiness and the crises that come up when we do something so bold as to love other people, engage in relationships, build lives with each other, make commitments and promises. So we talk about all of that every Wednesday, every monthly, the second Wednesday of every month. I had a really strong response to my last month's webinar we talked about a specific fear, stress, trauma response, which was called the fawn, please, or appease response. So it told me you guys wanted to dig a little bit more into that topic. So I'm going to speak more generally and educate you on what is going on in this body when we experience fear. So it's going to get a little sciencey and technical with the brain stuff, but to me, even as a therapist, I find psychology to sometimes be really intangible. Why doesn't this work? Why does it work? Why do we react this way? Why does my husband or wife react this way? And so I really find when we dive into the biology, the physiology, the neurobiology, it gives a lot of aha clarity moments. That's my personal opinion. And so I think one of the biggest mistakes we make in relationships, in life in general, is when we see this kind of giant thing called a human, wrapped up in a huge organ called skin, we think that we're just this one entity that's kind of this united front operating with like a common goal and a common strategy. And we think we're all, this human being is moving down this path towards seeking meaningful relationships, having a professional life, meeting goals, acting in line with our values, pursuing love, connection, caring for our loved one, etc. But we have to appreciate that we have multiple systems running around in our body, and they're not always congruent, nor do they always work in line with one another. In fact, some show up faster and more efficiently than the other ones. Some take a little bit longer and a little more talking and time to show up. So we need to really learn about all these different systems. It can create a greater level of understanding about yourself and shed light about why you do what you do. Also help you garner more empowerment and tools to kind of take back control where you feel you've lost control in your body with emotions, with physical reactions. And it also can shed light about your loved ones, about why he or she may be doing what he's doing. A lot of you here are here because you've been victimized by your partners making decisions in their addiction. A lot of harm, lying, living double lives. So this can sometimes be helpful at you understanding that as well. Never making excuses, just giving you a contextual understanding about the brain and operating systems. So the systems that we're going to talk about a little bit today that I want you to understand are all kind of playing different roles in, who you are as a human, who I am, Kristin, the parts of me, is my best friend, my prefrontal cortex, right? I have the parietal lobe and the prefrontal cortex. This is what makes up me. Like I hold memories and there's consequences if I do this. These are my value systems. I want to do this to stay in line with my value system. This is what I do when I feel sad, angry. These are the better choices. Don't eat 19 Oreo cookies. You're going to feel sick afterward. I can be rational. I can manage the rest of the other whacked out systems that go on in my life, which we're going to talk about today. The other system is the whacked out system that shows up really quickly, which is what we're going to spend the bulk of our time on today, which is the fear and stress response. That's our survival mechanism, kind of in that back brain limbic system. It shows up quick. It's efficient. Its entire purpose is not entire purpose is to reflexively keep us alive. So not even, it's a reflex. Remember, like when you're at the doctor's office and you hit your knee and your knee kicks out, you don't think about it, you don't process, it just happens. And we're grateful for it because it also tells my body to breathe, even when I'm sleeping. It digests my body while I'm not thinking. So that, that limbic back there system, we want that system to be going and moving, but it can also wreak havoc on our relationships because there's another system underneath that, that is the shame and trauma systems that we have going on. So our brains are highly adaptive. They're constantly collecting information. And since one of our number one goals is just to survive, but also we survive when we're in community and we're in connection with other people. We avoid bad things, run from pain, go towards pleasure. So we have these voices and stories we tell ourselves regarding shame, which I have so many videos on that. We're not covering that today, but shame informs and can create a fear stress response in our body, because to be disconnected from other people, to gain evidence that we're unlovable or we're too broken, or that bad thing that happened makes me unlovable, not desirable, or he's behaved in this certain way, which is evidence that he doesn't like me or love me, that really wires deeply in our brain and shows up all the time. Trauma is also very similar to that. We collect you'll learn from this lecture that our fear stress response system is highly adaptive and constantly collects data, and any kind of traumatic event really plugs into our long-term memory because it's all in service of keeping us alive. It is not in service in keeping us sane. It is not in service of my value system. It doesn't give a crap about either of those things. So it will sometimes, if unchecked, if not processed and worked through, drive us insane, destroy our relationships, lead to addiction, etc. So today we'll be talking about the biology of fear and trauma, how fear can turn into trauma, and treatment and tools to heal and unwire the impacts of fear and trauma in our body and mental health. Let's talk about some definitions. What is fear? Well, so scientists argue, and let me caveat this by a lot of this information I'm going to share with you today is from a professor at Stanford that I really like. I think he speaks in a very layman's terms way that's very understandable. I don't agree with everything he says. That's, every clinician and scientist has different opinions on things. His name, if you'd like to look him up, is Dr. Andrew Huberman. He is a neurobiologist at Stanford University. So this is some of his work, but it's also some other separate work from other research I've done. So what is fear? It's an extremely uncomfortable emotion and a neurobiological. So when I'm saying neurobiologically, like it happens in the brain, and biological happens in the body, it's a neurobiological experience. It leads to very specific body changes. So that's one interesting thing when we talk about emotion and feelings. We call them feelings. Why? Because they create just that, feelings, sensations in our body, quickening of your heart rate, shortness of breath, intense focus in through your eyes, through your pupils, blocking out other things. And it also, though, is not just a sensation in your body, it comes with cognitions, thoughts. So run away, I feel this, I'm scared, so we also have a emotional feelings, cognitive component as well. Fear occurs in response to a stimuli. So our body tends to like to be like in homeostasis, complacency. So for the most part, unless we have severe trauma, severe what we call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, when there is not a stimuli, our body is not supposed to be in a state of a fear stress response. And some of you are probably rolling your eyes right now because you're currently in a constant fear and stress response. So we're going to talk about that. So we want to dissect in this next, 15, 20 minutes about how fears are formed, how trauma is formed, and that you do have power. There's evidence and science behind unwiring, rewiring, and then the key they've found is replacing those fear reflexes, trauma responses, with a more empowering memory, experience, sentiment, thought process, etc. So that's key. We're going to be talking about that. So here's some caveats. fear, the words fear, stress, anxiety, trauma, shame, they're often all intertwined. They're all a very like uncomfortable physiological sensation that occurs in our body. And but it's important to understand that while stress, anxiety, trauma, and shame can manifest physiologically like similar to a fear response. So someone that, they say that Brene Brown said that if I stuck you in an MRI machine and I stabbed you, your body would light up in a similar way than if I shamed you. I took something that was really sensitive and vulnerable and painful, and I just like emotionally stabbed you with it. So that's what I'm trying to say here, is that physiologically it might show up. So, but it's not 100% correlated with one another. So for instance, I pretty much never have fear without having a stress response in my body, but I can have stress, anxiety, fear of something that's coming, shame, without a fear stimuli, right? So that's the big difference that I want you to understand. Now, and then regarding trauma is usually comes from a fearful, threat-inducing, scary experience or experiences, right? One experience is acute, so you hear me say that, one experience, or just a short period acute, or long periods, like I was in an abusive relationship, I've had multiple traumas, multiple assaults, things like that. So either a fearful event or complex, fear and trauma over time. And our nervous system records it in our body, in our long-term memory, in a way that can resurface regardless of the threat being present anymore. So that's actually really interesting when you think about it, right? That trauma is any time you're finding yourself having flashbacks, experiencing that heightened heart rate, shortness of breath, that flooding of when you feel like blood is, drawing to your brain, shutting down. We talked last month about the fawn response. That is a sign of trauma, because maybe not maybe just a song is on the radio, or you smell something, or you drive down that street, or the anniversary is coming. The actual stimuli is not there, but it's just general enough that it's been recording in your brain as trauma, and it is coming out without the actual threat stimuli. So you get that difference? Fear is something has to be telling me right here, right now, that I'm in danger in some general way. And then trauma is when it continues to make you feel like you're in danger when the danger is not actually there anymore. So generally speaking, trauma occurs, and I have lots of helpful websites if you really want to understand what trauma is. It occurs when you feel like there's a loss of the 4 C's are context, like what's happening, how much longer is this going to be happening, how much longer do I have to be exposed to this. The big one is control and choice. Can I assert any power in this? If the answer is no, if there's more powerlessness, lack of choice, I will be more traumatized from that threat, from that fear experience and connection, that this bad thing that happened to me makes me different from others, afraid to connect with others, disconnected. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the science, the brain, that happens to your brain when you do experience trauma and fear. It's really interesting. Trauma happens pretty much anytime your neurobiology is overwhelmed and you lose power and choice, and you're not sure if you're going to survive it. Which I love to caveat this, that by the way, don't think a man needs to be holding me up with a gun and I think I'm going to be shot and killed. I tell the people all the time about betrayal trauma. I could be a wife leading a life with my 3 children and living in a home with a partner, and then I uncover this entire secret life of pornography, infidelity, that essentially the person that I trust and I lay with and I share space with and I'm a teammate with, I realize is not the person that I married, is a giant liar. And if they can lie to me, or if I can be fooled, then oh my God, what else am I not noticing? I can't trust my instincts. I can't trust anything. And so that is just the same as my entire life, livelihood, family being absolutely threatened. So let's take like liberties and understanding what we mean by threat. And this can, again, happen short period, acute, or complex. All right, into the brain science. So take a deep breath. Autonomic arousal, autonomic nervous system. This is that survival brain back there that we don't want to lose. It can save us. It can get us to jump out of the way of the car it's quickly read the trajectory and the speed of the car coming at us with the trajectory of how far away the curb is. And it doesn't even need our brain. It kicks our legs faster and gets us breathing deeply and automatically makes us grab, our kids near us and shoves us onto the curb before we can even think or process. It's a reflex. We want it. It's an involuntary system, partly running your survival brain to reflex and move us. But when it is not doing the survival stress response reflex, it's running other reflexive systems in our body. Think involuntary systems, heart rate, breathing, some sexual responses, some sleep responses, digestion, immunity. We want these things. They run. And I always, when I talk about trauma and I mention this, it's really interesting to think, by the way, when you've been exposed to very serious trauma, what starts being long-term physiological consequences, right? Digestion issues, struggling with sleep, struggling with sexual responses, some immunity issues, et cetera, et cetera. They're all tied in. There's two branches of the autonomic nervous system, that survival system, that we want you to know about. The sympathetic has nothing to do with sympathy. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Sympathy, you think calming and quiet and compassion. Sympathetic nervous system is the upregulation system. It increases your alertness, it ramps up your vigilance, it gets you fired up. It's what shows up anytime you get some kind of stimulus or trauma reaction that something's bad. Parasympathetic is the downregulating system. It's calming, anything that when you're not in the state of stress or panic. If you're probably comparing it to the ventral vagal system, which we've talked about, the polyvagal system from Stephen Porges, it would be like, I'm here, I'm present, I'm in ventral vagal, I have the parasympathetic nervous system going on. Then we're going to get a little more techie. Andrew Huberman talks about the HPA Axis system that's within this autonomic arousal nervous system. HPA Axis covers three really important systems or parts of the autonomic nervous system running as well, which is the hypothalamus to the base of the brain. It's basic, it's primitive. Think of it's the caveman, basic needs. Me thirsty, me want to have sex. No, I don't want to mate with you. Temperature, me cold, me hot, me, right? Like me hungry. That's the hypothalamus, just basic. Your brain was built from the bottom up. And so these are like your caveman components. We call it lizard brain, all that kind of stuff. The pituitary, which is the releases hormones, because remember, you guys probably heard, if you know stress, you've heard of cortisol, adrenaline, things like that. Cortisol, estrogen, testosterone, that's pituitary glands, is releasing the hormones to signify a bunch of different things. And then the adrenal glands, HPA, hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal glands, which are adrenaline, as you can imagine, epinephrine, stress hormones. They also, but though they're not just stress, right? They're not just evil. When you wake up in the morning, you get flooded with some of your adrenal glands saying, oh, time to get up, time to move, time to do things, wakes you up, prepares you for action, but also can create extra alertness in you and push you into the stress response. So it's important to realize that these HPA systems can be brief. So really, really quick to come online. They're in the base of your brain, like I said. They're neurobiologically like very accessible, whereas your prefrontal cortex takes a boatload of oxygen, time, energy. Very quick to come online. So it could be like almost a car accident, and you feel that, oh my gosh, and you still, after the car accident, you're like, oh, what happened? And you're deep breathing and you feel a tingling in your body or whatever. And then you think later on, right? But first you swerve to miss whatever you saw on the street, or something was coming, or a person. And it can be fast acting and dissipate very quickly. Or it also has the power to stay fast acting, but also be a lasting component. It can build, this is what's incredible about the HPA Axis. It can build out new circuits. It's a learning system. Builds in new circuits of connections. This is bad, this is good, danger. It turns on and off gene expression, they're finding. So again, that goes into like third generation Holocaust survivors. When you're in that constant state of trauma, they're finding there's actual epigenetics of systems being turned on, off, etc. Maybe even that's where some of the addiction that runs into the family, but I don't know about that. But turning on and off gene expression, depending on how the experience lives in our system, right? Is it acute? Is it just a one-time thing like a car accident? It's not a continued problem. Or is it regular, like a 2-year pandemic? And then this, when I was listening to this part, it made me think of some of Dan Siegel's work, where Dan Siegel's work about deciding whether or not the trauma is going to really, F with you, wire in your brain and show up in a really detrimental, destructive way, is he says, was there support at the time of the trauma? Was there a safe place? Maybe this really bad accident happened or this pandemic happens, but is there a safe home to come to where they can talk about their feelings, where they can make sense of what happened, be validated, and then have a story of empowerment afterward? This is how you stay safe. This is what's going on. This is, maybe you can't control this, but you can control this. Things like that. So that's another thing that I think determines how long it's going to be present in your body. The neurobiology and circuits of fear. There's another part that's important to understand. It's the amygdala, and that is your threat reflex. So remember, it's a reflex. If you step on a sharp tack, Dr. Andrew Huberman mentions, if you step on a sharp tack, your foot, without even thinking, lifts up, but not just lifts up, it pushes down pressure on the other foot. It is a reflex to stop you from feeling pain. But you have, so just remember that. And there's all these different types of reflex that you feel, like I said, hitting your knee. If you're drinking a drink and something feels funny in your mouth, you spit it out right away, like without even thinking, oh, I'm in a nice restaurant. It's that reflection of, or I even wonder too, it's like when you watch other people throw up and then there's this like desire for you to throw up yourself. These interesting reflexive type things that happen in our body. And ultimately it's in service of your survival. In response to experiencing fear or a threat, there's a reflex in your body, an involuntary system that makes you want to quicken your heart rate, in case you have to run away and be fast, intense focus. It blocks out other noises. Accesses energy stores in your, if you have to make quick movement, running, etc. All of these systems, and keep in mind again, when it is running your fear stress response reflex system, you have to shut down or slow down or not spend time on the other systems that it's running. Remember, sleep, digestion, some sexual responses, your immunity response, etc. So keep that in mind about, the body keeps score, because it's got to focus on, how do I move in the state of this stressor that's happening? Remember, the 4 stress responses are the fight, flight, freeze, and then the fawn. Those are usually the ways that your body wants to show up in those ways. Remember, this entire system, especially the amygdala, is a very dumb, primitive, generic response system. It doesn't care about accuracy. It cares about making sure that you fight, fly, flee, fawn in a very quick way, and then your smart brain can show up later on and clean up the mess. That's kind of what's going on, right? And you think with the addict brain, they're not thinking about their commitments, their promises. They are acting out of like running towards this distraction, this pleasure, this numbing out, running away from pain. It is a primitive, generic response. And it's not because a bear's coming after me. It's because, I've been shamed, I'm in trauma, I don't see an exit, I never learned the skills, etc. So it doesn't care about your relationship. It doesn't care about who you want to be as a person. It's a reflex to be generally interpreted based on very general, overwhelming stimuli. It will apply the fear threat response to anything generally, learn from it, and then continue to apply it and build upon it as the years go by, as experiences continue to be had. Now, if you understand the amygdala reflex system, then you can start understanding how you can unwire it, rewire it. Now, you have to realize threat comes in through our sensory systems, right? So we hear a sound, we see something with our eyes, ears, nose, mouth, touch, and it records it for whatever reason as a threat. And we decide in those milliseconds, is it something that I can fight? Is it something that I need to run away from? Is it something that I need to freeze because I've been in this situation before? I know I never win. And so I have to dissociate, disconnect from it, prepare for death, whatever, metaphorically or literally. That often happens when it's complex trauma. The family member comes into the room multiple nights and you have to freeze and dissociate. And then the fawn response, that comes from complex trauma too. We've also mentioned, when I've talked about my trauma lectures before, that the amygdala system also releases those organic opiates. If you've watched my trauma videos before, it talks about it can release natural pain, like analgesics, to kind of prepare you for death, prepare you for the bad thing to happen. Or it also will activate, release adrenaline, epinephrine, norepinephrine to create arousal, right? So you're hearing that fight, flight, freeze. It's giving you all of those things in one package. The triggering of the amygdala complex does not require an actual threat. It can just be a memory, a reflex, not a real thing. Now, because this is where things get interesting. This is, now that you have all that information, here's the hope part. There's another system that's voluntary, so it doesn't come online as quickly, but there is a big player in the fear, stress, trauma, reflexive responses. And that's what we call your top down response, your good old prefrontal cortex, what's going to help you out of all this stuff, get you back to connection with your body, with your community, remind you of who you're supposed to be as a person, remind you of your promises and commitments. It can control or suppress a reflex. So it has a power to trump or replace the trauma. So really, when you think about it, I was trying to think of sometimes when my body was telling me to do something and I was like, no, like this doesn't make sense. So I used to be a lifeguard, diving. I always wanted to jump off the 10-meter. So I wanted to. It's something that I thought would be so cool. I watch people jump off it all the time. It looked really amazing. I got up there and my eyes saw 10 meters is very high. I'm not sure if you guys know that. Didn't look as high from up there. And I had in my head, I want to do this. And so I get to the end and my body's like, hell no, you're not jumping off that like 10-meter. That is scary business. And I had to stop and talk to it for a minute and be like, no, you see people do this all the time. That's just water down there. What's the worst thing that can happen? I jumped off it. Another time my body surprised me is I was walking one time and I had to walk through a turnstile in very close proximity to Shaquille O'Neal. And I know who he is. He's famous. There's a bunch of people around him. But when I walked by him, I came to his waist. And so when this giant body walked by me, you'd think I'd be like, wow, there's Shaquille O'Neal, like famous basketball player. And it was like in the heart of the Laker, like triumphant victory season time frame. I wanted to be like, wow, what a minute. I was shocked that all I felt was this flood of fear come through my body of like giant object that could crush you in 3 seconds. Should that being show, it trumped my prefrontal cortex. And I had to kind of turn my prefrontal cortex back on and be like, there's no fear here. Nothing bad's going to happen to you. Calm down. This giant human body in front of you is not someone that's going to attack you. But those are really great, basic, simple examples of acute reactions, reflexes that with turning on your prefrontal cortex, bringing in a new narrative, a new experience, negotiating what this actual threat means and how you want to respond to it is a very effective way of getting on top of it. So you don't feel like it owns you, You own it. Now, let me remind you that takes a lot of time, oxygen, blood flow. You cannot eliminate fear, nor would you want to, but the stress trauma responses don't have to own and control you. You can turn on your prefrontal cortex, and we're going to be talking about that in the final moments about how we can kind of treat that. Much of the fear system is a memory system. So you can use your prefrontal cortex to reframe these memories, make meaning, finding out what was protective, how you showed up and why you showed up in this way, and now you know better and now you need to do better. Parts of what you want to take from that experience, learn from it, gain from it, get rid of what's not in service of your journey from now to the future. Tools to work through. So now we're going to talk about some different schools of thought about how to work through fear, trauma, and stress response. So because just like the system is a memory system and wires around memories and experiences, it can be unwired in the same way. So there's hope, ladies and gentlemen. For example, I was stung by a bee when I was a kid, and for a while, I never cared about bees before. When I got stung, suddenly I was like, get away from me, bees, so scary. But over the past few years after not being stung by bees, my reaction isn't quite so overwhelming. Now, there's broader, more complex traumas like attachment trauma, fear of a particular person because they've harmed you, they've betrayed you, fear of connection, fear of intimacy, complex. Those need to be worked on a little bit more, right? It's not just time that heals the wound. So there's a few therapies that many people have overlapped to say these are effective ways of treating trauma. One of the therapies, the most basic one, is using psychotropic medication, which, by the way, only doctors can prescribe medications, but we're talking SSRIs, benzodiazepines. The only problem is those are only stopping the symptoms of the fear response. They are only kind of muting the reflexive response. They're not getting to the core problem. They're not extinguishing the source from which the memories were recording, right? The body keeps score, friends. There is behavioral therapies. So you've heard of like exposure therapy, cognitive processing therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. He was particularly a fan of it. I'll be honest, I'm not surprised a scientist is a fan of CBT because it's very like concrete and structured. People like Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who I like his work, he doesn't seem to be that into CBT. So, but what he finds is that if you want to get out of this reflexive trauma and stress responses owning you instead of the other way around, they're finding there's some basic components that have to exist across the board, which is that you have to be able to expose yourself, re-expose yourself, and there's arguments about how much you need to expose yourself to the trauma again. Behavioral therapists say in detail, smells, sights, stories over and over and over again, because if you continue to expose yourself, either literally, so if I'm afraid of dogs, exposing myself to a dog, it diminishes the fear response to it over and over again, right? So it'd be like if I drove in a car in the rain and I got in a bad car accident, it'd be continue to drive in the car in the rain. But then this time it's successful, and all these successful experiences will diminish the fear that you have. Now, again, the complex stuff, I don't know how I feel about that. And I also don't know how I feel about the full physiological dive into all the bad stuff that's happened. But the theories that expose it, talk about it ad nauseum over and over again with the help of a well-trained clinician, it diminishes the fear response. But here is the most important part, which is really important, which you see overlap in all these trauma therapists. You must learn a new narrative, new association, new framework to the stories, to the traumatic stories, the fear-inducing stories, the stress experiences that occurred. They are breakers and blockers of the reflex being triggered again in the future. So it's not just because I have the story of empowerment, it stops and blocks the future reflexive response. So for instance, let me clarify that, because you can never make a positive out of like a very scary traumatic event, right? So how do I make a positive? I can't say, oh, it wasn't bad that I found out that my husband of 20 years led this secret life. And um, but maybe through work you can say, okay, well, I always knew that something wasn't right, and now at least we're working in truth and transparency. He's healing today, I'm healing today, he's being honest today. We now know everything about each other, and we're growing into a deeper level of intimacy connection. He's staying present for my healing process. I have been able to lean into a great supportive group of other people where I can help them, they can help me, we can be of service to each other. It's kind of lessened my worry and given me perspective about trying new things in life, because I feel like I've been through hell and back already. Like, what's the worst thing that I'm going to happen? That my marriage was, a facade and I was bamboozled for my partner? Like, sure, I can go try a new career now, because it just might lessen your fears and your perspectives of what something's really scary. So that's kind of what I mean by recreating a new framework, a new association, etc. You can never forget about what happened, but you can see ways that our brain has attached meaning, purpose, the ways that you've survived it, how you can stay safe in the future. That's huge for betrayed partners. It's, you may never 100% trust your partner again, but that's why we have to get into disclosures to understand his or her patterning, triggers, the many, M-A-N-Y, many, M-I-N-I, things that lead to relapses. So you can read the signs in the future. You can feel like there's a community that he or she can turn to keep on recovery, that you can lean into, that you can talk things out with. That's the way we block those reflexes and have a willingness to engage with the person that at one point was like the murderer living in my house. So the narrative is one of the most valuable tools to rewire our fear stress responses. EMDR, that's something that I'm getting trained on, and that's a way that they felt like you can reprocess your memories. EMDR does not believe you plunge into the entire recapping of traumatic events. You maybe choose one little memory, one moment. You get into the negative thoughts that you had associated with it, the shame story you have with it. You continue to expose yourself until the disturbance diminishes. You use bilateral stimulations because they found there's science that shows that it actually diminishes or down regulates your fear responses. And then you replace it with a positive cognition. This is the way I'm going to handle it in the future. I have the skills to do this now. This doesn't own me. This just is not my identity. And it claims the BLS, the bilateral stimulations, whatever those may be, help suppress the threat fear circuitry. Somatic experiencing, a little bit similar, but they use the body movement through the traumatic experience to kind of take power back, do what your body wanted to do in that moment, but it was too afraid or it couldn't fight the person off, etc. Internal family systems, that's essentially owning all the different parts of ourselves. There is no bad part. There was the protector. There was the one who was trying to keep the marriage together. There was the person that was trying to show up this way who didn't know this part, but now I know. It's internal family systems. Mixing in, there's some school of thought. He talks in one of his podcasts about mixing in psychedelics to trauma treatment, ketamine, etc. I'm not going to get into that. Breathing is free, it's accessible to all, and it's the best system to trick your brain into calming down when it thinks it's dying. He specifically suggests this almost like when you're going through labor, right? That he got into the science of it about why that particular breath system works, but it kind of like a little bit stresses your body out through that kind of erratic breathing system. So when you do it several times and then calm down, it like relaxes your body even more. It's kind of that concept, I think, kinesiologically about like when you stretch a really tight muscle, you push it and then you relax it. And then that means you can usually push a little bit farther and then you relax it. Right? There's something there about a little bit of stress isn't bad because it allows the relaxation process to happen a little bit more. And finally, a little bit of information about social connection for all of you who are trying to go this alone, which you're here, so you're obviously not going alone, but don't try to go this alone. There's this thing called tachykinin. It's a molecule in your brain that shows up when fear, stress, trauma occurs to reinforce the circuitry for the future. So it's the guy that's saying, okay, this was really, really scary. I'm going to wire this really tightly in you to continue to be scared, to continue to be stressed, to continue to respond this particular way reflexively. Well, but that molecule is also highly associated with it. Anxiety, depression, aggression. It leads to a lot of mental health struggles. Remember, your fear reflex does not care about who you are as a person, doesn't care about your mental health, it cares about your survival. Well, they found that tachykinin, those levels increase when you are socially isolated, when you are trying to go this alone, when you are disconnected from the world. And they decrease when you are engaging with trusted other people. So if you want to dissipate these molecules that are focused in keeping you in fear, in stress, in depression, in anxiety, in aggression, from that, a couple of those studies, you would conclude social engagement is absolutely imperative to the process. So combination of all those things. And that is everything on the fear and trauma response.
Okay, next question. What do you do when your SA keeps causing you trauma? He is doing therapy, 12-step. He stays in shame, steps out of shame at times, but not consistently. I know he is not in good recovery. How do I stay safe? I think that's your real question. I realize he has sickness, but what tool can I use to stay in the moment? That's a really great question.
I hope that this lecture helps you really create a framework or an understanding for what's going on in your body. If someone is not in recovery and they don't say what they mean what they say, they're not keeping your feelings and thoughts and needs in regard, it's hard to feel safe again. So the broader question is, what do I need to do to feel safe? What kind of boundaries do I need to set up? Are there consequences to the actions that he or she is doing when he steps out of recovery or doesn't follow through in his promise to attend 12-step meetings, or misses too many appointments with the therapist, or isn't getting a sponsor and actually working the steps? Sometimes I think a lot of the lack of safety feels like, oh, he's doing everything right, like going to therapy, going to 12 steps, but you can tell it's like a behavioral check it off the box, right? They're not soul changing. They're following, like doing this to stay out of consequences. So sometimes, unfortunately, the answer needs to be consequences. And so you have to, first and foremost, you can never heal unless your body feels safe, and doesn't keep getting fear and trauma input from your environment.
Yeah, and the healthy boundaries. I was almost late for this because I was talking to somebody, and this person shared that they had non-negotiable boundaries that the addict had just run through, but there weren't really consequences to it. I was like, well, then it's not really a boundary. So for you, I would, as Kristin said, what healthy boundaries do you need for your safety so that his behavior isn't just constantly traumatizing you? For some, it is, you need to increase your level of working a higher level of care because he isn't, he's not in recovery when all of this kind of stuff is happening. So what does he need in order to be in recovery so that he can eventually become a safe place for you? We have an Out of the Doghouse work group, and that talks about, here's what you need to do to become trustworthy, and if you want to be in a relationship, this is what you need to do. If you don't want to be in a relationship, don't do any of these things. But it isn't fair to be in a relationship and still, actively causing trauma and problems and everything else. And he's not happy either. He's living in shame. He's living in all the horrible stuff of addiction, not the benefits of recovery. So both of you, I would encourage you to get more support and help. But you setting healthy boundaries for you, would be a great start. But Kristin also mentioned it too. It's like I'm warming a seat in a meeting. I'm doing these things well, but I'm not I'm not doing them. I'm warming a seat. So so I hope I'm glad you're here, and I hope you
Yeah.
continue to find support for
And safe
you.
it, yeah, and safe in the moment was the last sentence. And it's like, well, okay, that person's not safe. You need to be around. Remember that last bit of study that I showed you, be in community with some other people that can show you what it's like to follow through with their commitments and promises. Some other safe people, right? So you can garner safety from other social connection. It doesn't need to just be from your partner right now.
Kristin, this was so fabulous. Like I said, I'm going to like, it's a lot. I feel like I went to a science class, but it was so good. I mean, this is such useful stuff. I will actually be watching this one again too, because I learned a lot. I'm so grateful for you. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for the questions. I'm going to get this posted on sexandrelationshiphealing.com this afternoon. Watch it again with me. And we'll see you in March.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and thank you, everyone. If you have any questions, you can email me at kristinsnowdenmft@gmail, or you can go to my website, kristinsnowden.com, and join my mailing list to find out about future events or anything like that. I also have a YouTube channel, Kristin
And she's
Snowden.
got great betrayed partner work groups. And you also, because she's Brene Brown trained, so she does a lot of great work. Check out her website, kristinsnowden.com, for more resources, and join us again.
Yes, thank
Thanks,
you. Thanks for
everybody.
joining. Bye.
Bye.